the diner was silent. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, the kind of tension that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The only sounds were the slow drip of coffee into a half-full pot behind the counter and the faint hum of an old ceiling fan struggling to keep up with the heat. Then, the door swung open. Boots stomped against the linoleum floor, heavy and deliberate. The kind of footsteps that weren't in a hurry, because they didn't have to be. Everyone in the diner turned toward the entrance, and a hush fell over the place like a blanket of fear. The bikers had arrived. They were a rough-looking bunch, leather jackets, scuffed boots, tattoos winding up their arms like vines of menace. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel smirk, let out a low chuckle as he surveyed the room. His boys fanned out, filling the empty spaces, making sure everyone knew there was no escape. And then they saw him. Clint Eastwood sat in the corner booth, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat, sipping his black coffee as if he hadn't noticed a thing. But everyone else noticed. The bikers noticed. A sneer curled across the leader's face as he sauntered over to the table, his presence reeking of arrogance. He leaned in, hands on the table, voice dripping with mockery. Well, what do we have here? No response. Clint set his coffee down, slow and deliberate. His fingers didn't tremble. His eyes, barely visible beneath the shadow of his hat, flicked upward, just enough to let the biker know he had been seen, assessed, and dismissed as unworthy of further attention. The biker's sneer faltered. Something funny, old man? Still, no answer. The tension in the room thickened. The waitress, a young woman with shaking hands, stood frozen behind the counter. The cook had stopped flipping burgers. The sheriff, sitting at a nearby table, shifted uncomfortably, but made no move. Everyone knew the rule: when the bikers showed up, you stayed quiet, you stayed out of the way, and you prayed they left without breaking anything. But today was different. Clint's lack of reaction wasn't defiance, it was worse. It was disinterest. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't impressed. He simply didn't care. And that drove the leader mad. The biker grabbed Clint's coffee and tossed it onto the floor, the ceramic shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. Look at me when I talk to you. Clint exhaled slowly, then finally lifted his chin, locking eyes with the man in front of him. His gaze was cold. Unshaken. You really want to do this? Clint asked, his voice calm. The leader's grin widened. Oh, I do. The other bikers chuckled, some cracking their knuckles, others reaching for their belts, where steel and chains waited. The sheriff cleared his throat, standing, but before he could get a word out, the biker raised a finger and wagged it at him. Not your business today, Sheriff. This is between me and him. The sheriff hesitated. He was outnumbered. Everyone in the diner knew he wouldn't risk it. Clint? He simply leaned back in his booth, looking up at the biker with an expression that was closer to amusement than concern. You sure? Clint asked again. The leader scoffed. Oh, I'm sure. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of Clint's mouth. Then let's step outside. The room froze. The biker blinked, as if he hadn't expected that response. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but only for a moment. He recovered quickly, laughing as he took a step back. All right, cowboy, the biker said. Let's dance. The other bikers hooped and hollered, shoving tables aside, making a clear path to the door. The sheriff swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his belt, but he knew better than to get involved. Clint stood up. Slow. Purposeful. He adjusted his hat, brushed non-existent dust from his sleeve, and turned toward the exit. The crowd parted as he walked past, the hush of anticipation replacing the hum of the diner's old neon lights. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the empty street. The town felt smaller now, the buildings pressing in like silent witnesses. The biker leader rolled his shoulders, flexing his fingers, the tattoos on his knuckles stretching like predators waking from a nap. He cracked his neck. "You got no idea what you just signed up for, old man." Clint said nothing. He just looked at him. A long, steady stare. And that was when something shifted. Something deep. The biker leader felt it. His boys felt it too. A whisper of uncertainty slithered through them, though none of them would admit it. Because Clint Eastwood didn't look worried. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who had already seen the outcome. And that's when the biker leader finally understood. He had made a mistake. The air outside felt heavier than it should have, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. A small crowd had gathered just beyond the edge of the diner, standing on the cracked sidewalk, eyes darting between Clint Eastwood and the leader of the biker gang. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting everything in deep orange hues. It should have been a peaceful evening, one of those quiet small-town sunsets, where the air smelled like dust and home-cooked meals. But peace had left with the shattered coffee cup inside the diner. The sheriff stood near the door, his jaw clenched tight. He had a duty to keep the town safe, but right now, he was just like everyone else, waiting to see what Clint Eastwood would do. The biker leader smirked as he rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles with exaggerated movements. "You don't know what you just got yourself into, old man," he sneered, his voice loud enough for his crew to hear. A few of them chuckled, but the laughter lacked the confidence it had inside the diner. Clint stood still. No anger. No fear. Just watching. That silence, it did something to people. The biker leader shifted his stance, his smirk faltering just slightly. "What's the matter?" he goaded. "Did you forget how to fight?" Still, Clint said nothing. The leader scoffed. "All right, fine. I'll start." In one swift motion, he swung. A hard, mean punch aimed straight for Clint's jaw. And then something happened. Something no one saw coming. Clint didn't flinch. Didn't move. At the very last moment, just as the fist was about to connect, he stepped aside, so smoothly, so effortlessly, that the biker's own momentum threw him forward. His knuckles struck empty air. The leader stumbled, caught himself, and turned back, eyes flashing with irritation. The other bikers murmured. He'd missed. Clint Eastwood didn't dodge like a man running from a fight, he moved like a man who had already won. The leader growled and lunged again, throwing another punch. Faster. Stronger. He wanted to make a point. Clint sidestepped. Effortless. Precise. And then he spoke. "You're too slow." The words were quiet, but they hit harder than any punch. The murmurs among the bikers grew louder. Some of them weren't laughing anymore. The leader's face twisted with frustration. "I'll show you slow." This time, he didn't just throw a punch. He charged. Full force, fists swinging. Clint moved like smoke. One step back. Another step to the side. A slight tilt of his head. Every strike missed by inches. The biker leader swung wildly, hitting nothing but air. Clint wasn't fighting. He was waiting. And the biker was getting tired. The crowd saw it. The bikers saw it too. A shift in the air. Clint wasn't just dodging, he was controlling the fight without throwing a single punch. The leader's breath came heavier now. His fists weren't as fast. His steps weren't as sharp. And then Clint moved. One quick, precise motion. He stepped in. A simple twist of his wrist. Before anyone could register what happened, the biker leader was on the ground. Face down. Hard. The gasps were audible. It had happened so fast, most people hadn't even seen it. Clint stood over him, his face unreadable. He didn't look proud. He didn't look angry. He just looked down. The biker leader groaned, trying to push himself up. His arms shook beneath him. Clint crouched down, just enough to be heard. His voice was steady. Calm. Go home. The leader swallowed hard, his pride caught between his teeth. But when he looked up, when he really looked into Clint Eastwood's eyes, he saw something that made his breath hitch. A man who had seen things. A man who knew things. A man who was giving him a choice. Silence stretched, then, slowly, the biker leader pushed himself to his feet. His men were frozen, waiting to see what he'd do next. He took a step back. Then another. He nodded once. Then turned. Without a word, he walked to his bike. His crew hesitated. Then, one by one, they followed. Engines roared to life, but they didn't speed off with the usual arrogance. They left quietly, as if they'd just encountered something they couldn't explain. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They had just witnessed something far more powerful than a fight. Clint Eastwood adjusted his hat, turned, and walked back inside the diner. He poured himself another cup of coffee. And as he took a sip, the sheriff let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Nobody said a word. They didn't have to. They had just learned something. Something about true strength. Something about the kind of man who didn't need to fight to win. Inside the diner, the silence was louder than any words. The sheriff shifted uneasily in his seat, his fingers still twitching near his belt. The cook, a burly man who had seen his fair share of trouble, wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the window where the last of the bikers were disappearing into the horizon. The waitress, still clutching the coffee pot in her trembling hands, stared at Clint as if she were seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just an actor. He was something else. Something more. Clint Eastwood took a slow sip of his freshly poured coffee, his expression unreadable. If he was proud of what had just happened, he didn't show it. If he was afraid of what might come next, there was no sign. He simply sat there. Like nothing had happened at all. The sheriff finally broke the silence. You all right? Clint didn't look up. Never better. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, stealing another glance at the door, as if expecting the bikers to change their minds and storm back in. They'll be back, the sheriff muttered. Men like that don't take kindly to, well, he gestured vaguely toward the door. Clint set his coffee down, finally meeting the sheriff's gaze. They know better now. The sheriff let out a slow exhale. I don't think that leader of theirs is the type to walk away from embarrassment. You humiliated him in front of his whole gang. Clint leaned back, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I gave him a choice. The waitress cleared her throat, finally finding her voice. That was incredible, she breathed. I mean, the way you moved. I've never seen anything like that. Clint simply nodded. He wasn't one for unnecessary words. But the moment wasn't over. From outside, the low rumble of an engine made the small group tense. The sheriff stiffened, his hand moving toward his gun. The cook took a cautious step toward the back kitchen, ready to grab the shotgun he kept under the counter. The waitress held her breath. Clint? He didn't even turn his head. A single motorcycle rolled to a stop outside the diner, the deep growl of the engine idling for a few seconds before cutting off. The leader. Alone. The diner door creaked open. Boots thudded against the linoleum floor. The air inside felt even heavier than before. The biker leader stepped forward, his lips slightly swollen, a bruise already forming near his jaw where he had hit the ground. His eyes were locked onto Clint, but there was something different in his stare. Not anger. Something deeper. Something unsettled. Clint slowly raised his coffee cup, took a sip, and set it back down. Didn't think you'd come back alone, he murmured. The leader inhaled deeply, his fingers flexing at his sides. Had to. The sheriff stayed on edge, his fingers twitching. The biker turned slightly toward him. Relax, lawman. If I wanted trouble, I'd have brought the boys back with me. He returned his gaze to Clint. A long silence passed between them. Then, the biker finally spoke. What are you? The question wasn't meant as an insult. It was genuine. The man had spent years on the road, built a reputation on fear, carved out a name for himself as someone who didn't back down. And yet, today, he had. Not because he was beaten. Because he had seen something in Clint Eastwood that he couldn't explain. Something he hadn't seen in any man before. Clint met his gaze, steady and calm. Just someone who's been around long enough to know when a man's fighting to prove something he doesn't have. The biker's jaw tightened. And what's that? Clint's voice was low, steady. Respect. The leader flinched like he'd been struck. The words hit harder than any punch ever could. His whole life, he had built his name on fear. On making people flinch when he walked into a room. On making them lower their heads when he spoke. And yet, Clint Eastwood, a man who hadn't thrown a single punch, had made him feel small without raising his voice. The leader swallowed hard, looking away for a moment. His fists clenched and unclenched, his mind working through something he had never considered before. After a long pause, he finally sighed. "You could have humiliated me worse out there," he muttered. "Could have made me look weak." Clint shrugged. "Didn't need to." Another silence. Then, the biker did something no one expected. He reached into his jacket pocket. The sheriff tensed. The cook took a half step forward. But Clint remained still. The biker pulled out a chain. A thick silver chain with a heavy pendant hanging from it. He stared at it for a moment before placing it on the table in front of Clint. A long beat of silence. Then, the leader straightened. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the door. He paused just before stepping outside. Glancing over his shoulder, he locked eyes with Clint one last time. "I don't know what kind of man you are," he admitted. "But I know I'll be thinking about this for a long time." And with that, he left. The door swung shut behind him. The diner remained silent. Everyone stared at the pendant sitting on the table in front of Clint. A symbol of something. Something unfinished. Clint reached out, picked it up, and studied it for a long moment. The sheriff finally exhaled. "What the hell just happened?" Clint's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Something good." The waitress swallowed. "You think he'll come back?" Clint slid the pendant into his pocket, standing up and tossing a few bills onto the table. "If he does," he murmured, adjusting his hat, "he won't be looking for trouble." He tipped his hat to the room and walked toward the exit, stepping into the fading light of the evening. No one followed him. No one stopped him. They just watched as Clint Eastwood disappeared down the street, leaving behind nothing but questions and a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. A lesson about power. A lesson about respect. And a lesson about knowing when to fight. And when to let a man learn for himself. End of part 3. Let me know when you're ready for part 4. You said. Countenue P4W1500. ChatGPT said. Here is part 4 of Bikers Threaten Clint Eastwood, his next move leaves them speechless. The night had settled over the small town, wrapping the streets in a blanket of silence. The neon lights of the diner flickered against the dark sky, casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. Inside, the tension still lingered, like smoke from a fire that had just been put out but hadn't quite cleared. The sheriff sat back down at his table, his coffee untouched. He stared at the door where Clint Eastwood had just walked out, his mind racing. "That man," he muttered under his breath. "What just happened here?" The waitress, still gripping the counter for support, shook her head. "I don't know. But I feel like we just saw something bigger than we understand." The cook, a man of few words, simply grunted. And then, for the first time in a long time, the town felt different. For years, the biker gang had been the shadow hanging over the people here, a constant reminder that power belonged to the loudest, the strongest, the most dangerous. But in a single moment, Clint Eastwood had shattered that illusion, not with his fists, but with something even stronger. Something none of them could quite put into words. The pendant he had left on the table still sat there, catching the light. The sheriff reached for it, turning it over in his hand. It was heavy. Engraved on the back were the letters MC, and beneath them, a date. The sheriff frowned. "Wait a second," he muttered, his brows drawing together. "I've seen this before." The waitress leaned in. "What do you mean?" The sheriff exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Years ago, there was a motorcycle club that ran these parts. Before this new gang came in, before all the trouble started. They weren't thugs, though. They kept the peace in their own way. You didn't mess with them, but they didn't mess with you either. They had one rule: respect the town, or you weren't welcome." The waitress blinked. "And?" The sheriff set the pendant down. "They disappeared. All of them. Nobody knows why. But this?" He tapped the pendant. "This belonged to them." A chill ran through the room. The cook finally spoke. "You think Clint Eastwood knew?" The sheriff hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "I think he knew a lot more than we did." Meanwhile, across town, Clint Eastwood walked down the empty streets, his hands in his pockets, the cool night breeze brushing against his face. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular. He was simply walking, thinking. The pendant was still in his pocket. He ran his thumb over it absent-mindedly. The night was quiet. But something told him the silence wouldn't last. Behind him, the low rumble of an engine broke through the stillness. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. The engine slowed, the sound shifting as the rider pulled up beside him. The bike rolled to a stop a few feet away, and the engine cut off, leaving behind nothing but the distant chirping of crickets. Clint sighed. "You back for another round?" he asked without looking up. The biker leader didn't answer right away. Instead, he climbed off his bike and stood still, watching Clint with a careful gaze. The cocky arrogance from earlier was gone. "I need to know something," the leader finally said. Clint turned to face him. The leader shifted his stance, crossing his arms. "How did you know?" Clint raised an eyebrow. "Know what?" The leader took a slow breath. "That I wasn't fighting for the right reasons." Clint studied him for a moment. Then, in a voice as steady as stone, he said, "Because I've seen it before." The leader's jaw tensed. He looked away for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "I spent my whole life proving myself. Making sure people feared me. Making sure they never questioned my strength." Clint nodded. "And where did it get you?" The leader exhaled sharply. "Nowhere." A silence stretched between them. Then, hesitantly, the biker reached into his jacket. Clint didn't move. Slowly, carefully, the leader pulled out another pendant. Identical to the one Clint had in his pocket. He held it out. Clint took it, turning it over in his palm. The same MC engraving. The same date. The leader's voice was quieter now. "That club, it belonged to my father." Clint looked up. The leader's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of something old, something unresolved. "He tried to teach me the same things you just did. I didn't listen." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Guess some lessons take longer to sink in." Clint closed his hand around the pendant. "It's never too late." The leader scoffed. "You sound like him." Clint smirked. He must have been a smart man. A long silence. Then, finally, the leader nodded. Without another word, he climbed back onto his bike. But before he left, he looked at Clint one last time. "I don't know why you came here," he admitted. "But I think this town needed you more than you know." Clint tipped his hat. "Maybe. But I'm just passing through." The leader gave a small nod. Then, he revved his engine and disappeared into the night. Clint stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle. Then, with a final glance at the pendant in his hand, he turned and walked back toward the diner. He wasn't planning on staying long. But something told him. The town wasn't quite done with him yet. The night stretched long and quiet. The town, usually blanketed in a heavy silence after dark, felt different now. Tension still lingered, but not the same kind. It wasn't the fear of trouble, it was the anticipation of change. Clint Eastwood walked back toward the diner, his boots crunching against the gravel with slow, steady steps. The pendant sat heavy in his pocket, the metal cool against his fingers as he absent-mindedly turned it over. This wasn't over. He could feel it. Inside the diner, the sheriff and the others still sat in tense silence. The cook had started wiping down the counter, the waitress had refilled coffee cups that nobody had touched, and the sheriff kept his eyes locked on the entrance like he was waiting for something, though he wasn't sure what. The bell above the door jingled as Clint stepped inside. All eyes turned to him. The waitress exhaled in relief. Thought maybe you'd left town already. Clint moved toward his booth and sat down, setting his hat beside him on the table. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the pendant, and slid it across the table, toward the sheriff. The sheriff picked it up, inspecting it carefully. His brows furrowed as he traced the engraving. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. Clint leaned back. "Your biker friend gave it to me." The cook stopped wiping the counter. The waitress stilled. The sheriff blinked. "You mean to tell me he just handed it over?" Clint smirked slightly. "Something like that." The sheriff set the pendant down and exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This just keeps getting stranger." Clint reached for his coffee. "You ever wonder why that gang moved in when they did? Why they took over so easily?" The sheriff scoffed. "Because they were bigger, meaner, and had no one standing in their way." Clint shook his head. "They had someone standing in their way. But he left." The waitress frowned. "Who?" Clint tapped the pendant on the table. The realization hit the sheriff all at once. He sat up straighter, his expression shifting. "You're telling me?" "The old club didn't disappear," Clint interrupted. "They were pushed out. Someone wanted them gone." The sheriff swore under his breath. "And now their leader's son is running the gang that replaced them." Clint nodded. "Unfinished business." A long silence followed. The waitress was the first to speak. "So what does that mean?" The sheriff let out a slow exhale. "It means this town was never supposed to belong to them. And now, one way or another, they're gonna have to make a choice." Meanwhile, across town, the biker leader sat alone outside a rundown gas station, his motorcycle parked beside him, a cigarette dangling between his fingers. The night was cool, and for the first time in a long time, his mind wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with questions. His father had built something here. Something real. Something that meant something. And what had he done? Destroyed it. Replaced it with something cheap. Something empty. Clint Eastwood had seen it in him before he had seen it in himself. That was what unsettled him the most. He exhaled a long breath and pulled out his phone. A number he hadn't dialed in years stared back at him. His father's old lieutenant. The man who had tried to set him straight when he was young. The man he had ignored. For a long moment, he debated it. Then, before he could change his mind, he hit call. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a voice answered, rough and familiar. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." The leader swallowed hard. "We need to talk." Back at the diner, Clint Eastwood finished his coffee, the last drop settling on his tongue like the final note of a song. He stood, placed his hat back on his head, and dropped a few bills on the table. The sheriff watched him carefully. "You heading out?" Clint adjusted his hat. "Not just yet." The sheriff frowned. "So you think they're coming back?" Clint met his gaze, steady and certain. Not a matter of if. A matter of how. The sheriff let out a sigh. And when that time comes? Clint smirked. We'll see what kind of man he really is. The sheriff chuckled dryly. You always this cryptic? Clint tipped his hat. Only when it matters. And with that, he stepped outside, disappearing into the night once more. The town wasn't done with him yet. And he wasn't done with the town. The early morning light crept over the town, casting long shadows across the empty streets. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that signaled something was coming. Inside the diner, the sheriff sat at his usual booth, his fingers drumming against the table. He had barely slept. The events of the previous night still swirled in his head. Clint Eastwood had come into town, faced down the most feared gang around, and walked away without throwing a single punch. But something told the sheriff that things weren't over yet. The bell above the door jingled. The sheriff looked up just as Clint walked in, his pace steady, his expression unreadable. He slid into the seat across from the sheriff, tipped his hat back slightly, and signaled to the waitress for coffee. The sheriff exhaled sharply. You really planning on sticking around for whatever happens next? Clint didn't answer right away. He took the coffee from the waitress with a nod and took a slow sip before setting it down. Not much of a planner, he finally said. The sheriff shook his head with a chuckle. That's supposed to be reassuring? Clint smirked, but didn't say anything. Before the sheriff could press further, the sound of approaching motorcycles rumbled in the distance. Not just one. Not just a few. A lot. The sheriff stiffened. The waitress froze mid-step. Even the cook, who had always kept to himself, set his spatula down and turned toward the door. The rumble grew louder. Closer. Clint didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. Outside, the motorcycles pulled to a stop in front of the diner. The sheriff swallowed hard. This gonna be trouble? Clint finally looked up. We'll see. The door swung open. The biker leader stepped inside, his boots heavy against the tile floor. He wasn't alone this time. Several men followed him in, men who looked tougher, meaner, older than the usual crew that had been terrorizing the town. But there was something different in the leader's face. The arrogance from before was gone. He walked to Clint's booth and stopped, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. The sheriff tensed. His fingers hovered near his belt, ready for the worst. Then, the biker leader spoke. I made a call last night. Clint didn't blink. That so? The leader nodded. He gestured toward the men behind him. These are the last of my father's old crew. The ones who never wanted anything to do with what I turned this club into. The sheriff glanced between them, his brow furrowing. And what does that mean, exactly? The leader hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Then, finally, he said, it means I've been running from something I should have been trying to fix. The sheriff stared. You saying you're gonna fix it now? The leader exhaled. I don't know if I can. But I know I can't keep doing what I've been doing. A long silence followed. The waitress took a slow step forward. So, does this mean we don't have to be scared of you anymore? The leader flinched. It was a simple question, but it hit hard. He took a breath, then nodded. Yeah. That's exactly what it means. The sheriff crossed his arms. And your boys outside? They on board with this? The leader's expression darkened slightly. Not all of them. Clint finally spoke. You expecting a fight? The leader hesitated before nodding. Some of them aren't gonna want to give up the power they think they have, he admitted. They liked the fear. The control. They're not gonna want to lose it. Clint leaned back. So what are you gonna do about it? The leader straightened his shoulders. Gonna give them a choice. Clint smirked slightly. Like the one I gave you? The leader huffed a small laugh. Something like that. The sheriff rubbed his temples. You planning on handling this peacefully? The leader's jaw tensed. I'd like to. But I don't know if they will. Another silence. Then Clint stood up. He placed his hat back on his head and looked the leader in the eye. Then let's go find out. Outside. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the pavement. The group of bikers that had been waiting outside stiffened as their leader stepped out of the diner, Clint Eastwood and the sheriff close behind him. The tension in the air was thick. A few of the younger, wilder members of the gang exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. So what's this about? You make some kind of deal in there? The leader took a deep breath. Things are changing. The group stiffened. Scarcheek scoffed. The hell does that mean? The leader met his gaze, steady and firm. It means we're done terrorizing this town. We're done being the problem. Scarcheek barked a laugh. You've got to be kidding me. He turned to the others. You hearing this? He wants us to just roll over? The leader shook his head. No. I want you to make a choice. Scarcheek's sneer faltered. The leader continued. We go back to the way things were before we lost our way. Before we let greed and power take over. Or, he exhaled. You go your own way. The gang exchanged uneasy glances. Scarcheek clenched his jaw. And if we don't want to do either? The leader's face darkened. Then you're not welcome here anymore. A long, heavy silence. Scarcheek took a step forward, his fingers twitching at his side. That a threat? Before the leader could answer, Clint Eastwood spoke. It's a fact. Scarcheek turned to him, his lips curling into a sneer. And what the hell do you have to do with any of this? Clint adjusted his hat. Just a witness. Scarcheek scoffed, shaking his head. I knew you were trouble the second I saw you. Clint smiled slightly. Likewise. Scarcheek's nostrils flared. You got a real smart mouth, old man. Clint just looked at him. Scarcheek's face twitched with anger. Then, with a grunt, he turned back to the leader. You want to be weak? Fine. But don't expect the rest of us to follow. He turned to the rest of the gang. Anyone who's got any sense, come with me. A few men hesitated. Then, slowly, some of them stepped forward. Not as many as Scarcheek had expected. His sneer returned. Guess the rest of you want to hold hands and sing songs, huh? The leader didn't flinch. Guess so. Scarcheek spat on the ground. You're pathetic. Then, without another word, he climbed onto his bike. The few who followed him did the same. Engines roared to life. Then, with one final glare, Scarcheek and his men peeled out of town, leaving nothing behind but dust and the weight of a new beginning. The leader exhaled. Well, that's that. Clint smirked. Maybe. The leader frowned. You don't think they're gone for good? Clint looked off into the distance, where the bikes had disappeared. We'll see. The dust from the departing bikers still hung in the air, like a fading memory. The silence in the town felt less oppressive now, like the air had cleared, though the feeling of change was palpable. The streets seemed quieter, emptier, but in a good way. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The sheriff stood with his arms crossed, watching the last of the bikes disappear down the road. He had seen plenty of gangs come and go, but this? This was different. Clint Eastwood stood beside him, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, as always. That's it then? The sheriff asked, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Clint nodded slowly. That's it. The sheriff scratched his head, glancing back toward the diner, where the townsfolk were likely still talking about what had gone down. You think they'll really change? You think that leader can keep them in line? Clint gave a small shrug, his voice calm and steady. The leader's different now. You saw it yourself. That wasn't the same man who walked in here a couple of days ago. The sheriff looked over at Clint, considering his words. You don't think he's just putting on a show? Clint met his gaze. I think he's finally facing what he's been running from. It's not about power anymore. It's about redemption. The sheriff chuckled softly, shaking his head. Redemption, huh? You're a better man than I thought, Clint. Clint smirked, but said nothing. The sheriff took a deep breath, the weight of the situation starting to settle. He'd spent so many years watching the town bend under the thumb of fear and violence. The thought of it all shifting, of the balance of power finally tipping in favor of something different, was a lot to take in. I don't know if I can believe it, the sheriff admitted. I've seen too many men like that leader turn on a dime, just when you think they've had enough. He's not gonna let go of everything so easily. Clint's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. No, he won't. But he's not fighting for control anymore. He's fighting for something else. Maybe it's too late to fix everything, but at least he's trying. A long silence followed. The sheriff looked back down the road where the bikes had disappeared. He couldn't tell if this was the beginning of something new, or if the storm was just waiting for the right moment to return. Clint's voice broke the silence. It's not about whether or not they can change. It's about whether they want to. If they do, they'll have a chance. Sounds like you believe it, the sheriff said, still uncertain. I don't have to believe it, Clint replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. They do. The sheriff nodded slowly, but the doubt still lingered. He'd seen too much to put all his faith in a man who had spent years breaking everything he touched. He knew that kind of man didn't change overnight. But Clint seemed sure. And for some reason, the sheriff couldn't bring himself to doubt it either. Later that evening, the sun had set, painting the sky with shades of purple and orange, and the town was quiet once more. The streets were empty, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of peace in the air, like the whole place was on the brink of something good. Clint had gone back to his small rented cabin on the outskirts of town. The sheriff had returned to his house to think things over, but his mind kept coming back to Clint. There was something about the man, a quiet strength, an unshakable confidence, that had made everyone in town stand a little straighter. At least, for a little while. The phone in the sheriff's kitchen rang late that evening, breaking the silence. He picked it up on the fourth ring. Sheriff. We've got a problem. It was the deputy. The sheriff's heart sank. He'd known it was too quiet, too peaceful. What happened? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The bikers are back. The sheriff swore under his breath. What the hell are they doing back here? Looks like it's just a few of them. But they've got a message, the deputy replied, his voice tight. They want to meet with you. The sheriff rubbed his eyes, his mind racing. It couldn't be happening. They'd just left. They couldn't have changed that quickly. I'll be there, the sheriff muttered, hanging up the phone. He grabbed his jacket and moved toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside. The sheriff arrived at the meeting spot, a wide-open area just outside of town where the road met the edge of the forest. The headlights of several bikes illuminated the area, casting eerie shadows across the ground. The sheriff stepped out of his car and walked toward the gathering. A couple of the younger bikers stood by their bikes, looking uncomfortable, but none of them made any move toward the sheriff. Then, from the shadows, the leader stepped forward. He was alone. The sheriff paused, his hand instinctively resting on his gun. What's this about? He asked, keeping his voice low and steady. The leader raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. We're done, Sheriff. All of us. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. Done with what? The leader glanced back at his men, then stepped closer. Done being the bad guys. Done trying to force people into submission. We're not looking for trouble anymore. But there's something I need to tell you. I need your help. The sheriff's heart skipped a beat. Help with what? The leader swallowed. I can't keep them in line alone. I thought I could. I thought I was doing the right thing by taking control, but I was wrong. I've got men who want to stay in the past. They want to keep this town under their thumb. The sheriff's eyes flickered toward the group of bikers standing in the distance. He didn't see the same menace in them anymore. They looked unsure, nervous even. The leader continued. If you don't help me, Sheriff, we're going to lose everything. Again. For the first time in his life, the sheriff saw the fear in the leader's eyes. The kind of fear that came with the knowledge that the power you thought you had was slipping through your fingers. Tell me what you need, the sheriff said, his voice firm. The leader nodded. I need you to talk to them. If we can get them to listen, we can fix what we broke. But we need you. We need the town to trust us again. The sheriff paused, his hand still resting on his belt. This wasn't a fight. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a plea for help. All right, the sheriff said, his voice steady. I'll do what I can. And for the first time in years, the sheriff felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be smooth. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. The chance to rebuild. The chance to change.